All right. Esther chapter 3. We're ready for verse 7. Well, from chapter 2 to chapter 3 is about 5 years. Haman is promoted in verse 1 of the 3rd chapter by King Ahasuerus. He is promoted, if you will. It says that he's advanced him, set his seat above all the princesses, which were local governors, if you will. So it made him a governor, probably. It really doesn't give his title per se. But you had governors, then you had princesses, and so it seems as if he's somewhere in between the two. And maybe even higher. Who knows? Because he does get the king to make a decree. And as he does that, you look in verse 6, he said he was upset to lay hands. He wanted to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Why? Because Mordecai was not honoring Haman. Haman was a man that was egotistical, probably a narcissist, very much self-centered, very much wanted the praise, and Haman wasn't going to give it to him. We don't know why Haman would not bow down to Mordecai. Mordecai would bow down to Haman. There you go. I messed this up last week too, didn't I? But the thought is that Mordecai, being Jew, that the idea of bowing down to someone other than God was just something that he couldn't stand. Now that's pure conjecture. Scripture just says that Mordecai wouldn't do it. And so Haman is upset. Haman sought to destroy it, and notice verse 6, to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. That's what you need to remember. Haman was set on destroying all the Jews. Now we move forward. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month Adar. Nisan. We call it Nisan around here. It's Nisan. It actually means victory. But their first of the year would you put it on our calendar year, corresponds more to March, April, right in that time frame. And so what they're trying to determine is when this is going to fall. And notice, I'll get it up in a minute. There we go. Notice that they're casting lots. Now, some would get upset for that. Well, casting of lots was done in biblical times. We would liken it unto dice. In many ways, you might liken it to, you remember the magic 8-ball? You remember you'd have an 8-ball and you'd ask it a question, is it going to rain today? And you'd shake it and turn it over and it would say, well, if you hope. Well, duh. Casting of lots was, a lot of times, it was different for different places and different areas, but sometimes it would be rocks, and you would maybe put them in a bag and you would draw out, and the different colored rock would be, so to speak, the winner or the telltale. Sometimes it would be some other object that was somehow handled in such a way that you could ask a question, and depending upon what you got back, that was your answer. And it was not so much for folks in biblical times a game of chance as we would think of it, but it was a way of getting God to answer them for what they needed, sort of getting the counsel of God. And so that's what he does. They want to know, okay, when are we going to have this feast? When are we going to do all of this? And so it says, let's see, verse 8, then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there are certain people scattered and dispersed among the people and all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver unto the hands of those who do the work to bring it to the king's treasuries. He's set on getting rid of the Jews. He is, he's mad at Mordecai. He becomes then upset with the Jews, enraged with the Jews. He wants to get rid of them. Sort of maybe a more common modern day would be, of course, Hitler. But Haman wants to get rid of the Jews. He wants the king to make a decree to that end. Notice what he says. Notice the accusations, if you will, in verse 8. He says, the people are scattered and dispersed among all the people of the province. That was a true statement. He says their laws are different from all other peoples. And that's a true statement. Their laws with regards to God, they were God-centered and different than all the laws of all the land. And then he says, and they do not keep the king's laws. That seemingly was false. They kept the king's laws. So two truths and one false statement. It's sort of the way temptation works, isn't it? This sounds good and fine. This sounds good, it's fine. This third thing, it sounds plausible. It has to be true. It may not be. Haman's statements are trying to get Ahasuerus to pass this law. We need to get rid of these people. And so he goes on to conclude, look what he says, it's not fitting for the king to let them remain. Think about, for just a second, false counselors. Rehoboam had false counselors. He had good counselors, and he had false counselors. He listened to the false ones. He listened to the bad ones. Somebody's counsel to you is only as good as the individual. And sometimes it may not always be the best counsel. Should we listen to it? Can we gain from it? The answer is sure. Why not? And can we gain from it? Sure. Why not? Now think about Ahasuerus listening to Haman and listening to his unwise counsel. All to get rid of the people. All to get rid of the Jews. Why? Because Haman didn't like him. Why didn't Haman like him? Because he really didn't like Mordecai. Because Mordecai wouldn't fall down and honor him. And so he says it's fitting for the king to get rid of them. But he goes on to say in verse 9, he says that whoever, and he says, let it be written down, that destroy whoever, he says, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver to those that do it. Now, 10,000 talents of silver, it's believed to be, we think we know through archaeological finds, the approximate budget of the Persian Empire at that time, it would have been about 2/3 of it. So in other words, this was not a little sum of money. This was a great sum of money. Now you might say, well, where did he get it? How did he get it? I don't know. Maybe it's one of those where I'll give you, 10% down and pay the rest in monthly payments, or I'll do something. I'll find it somehow, somewhere. Maybe he didn't really have it. Who knows? But nevertheless, that's his promise. So the king, verse 10, the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you. I want you to think about 2 or 3 different things in this text. I want you to think about the signet ring. Let's think about the signet ring. Kings always had signet rings. Those that were in specific high power, but most notably the kings, had signet rings. Signet rings are just as we would think of them, a ring with something carved out, usually made of wood, some maybe initial or marking carved out. And you would take warm wax and you would put it on, say, a document, and the king would take his signet ring and he would mash that ring into the wax. It would let it cool there, and then he would remove his ring, and that would be his mark. And everyone would then know that this a document, an official document. And this was from the king. And so the king then gives that authority to Haman. He gives him that signet ring. And as he gives him that signet ring, he tells him, he says, you go do what seems good to you. There's a political answer if there ever was one. You go do what you think best. You see, he's saying it's all right to do it because he's given him the authority. In other words, if he really thought it was a bad idea, what would he have told Haman? No way. No way. We're not doing this. And he did, if you will, kept his signet ring on his finger or in his pocket. But he says, no. He says, you go do what you want to do. So he didn't, I don't think this was just a terrible, terrible idea. But he's also pulling himself away and saying, you do what you want to. You ever seen folks in authority do that? I have. I've seen folks in authority, you know, that sort of like, you remember David, and remember how that he told the men, you know, to Bathsheba's husband, you know, put him on the front, and then when you get into battle, everybody else pull back. I've had it done to me, to be honest. But yeah, it is. It's a political thing, if you will, and that's another great example. And so it's just one of those things that unfortunately folks do from time to time. But this is how he kind of kept face, if you will. Anything else? Yeah. Purim? I think so. We'll study that a little later on in this book. And of course, Purim is really our Easter, I mean, time-wise. Not the same thing, but the same time frame. And so it seems to me in my study that would be true, but I'm not 100% sure. Anything else? And so verse 12, we have Haman's proclamation. It says, then the king's scribes were called to the 13th day of the first month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors, those who were over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus. It was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. So notice what they call everybody in. Now, it's 11 months before all this is going to happen, because remember we saw in verse 7 about Nisan, they were casting lots, and so then it was determined that it would occur on the 12th month. So 11 months later, basically, Haman is going to get rid of all the Jews. Now, as I was reading that again last night, I was thinking, we all know that we will not live forever, physically. And one day we will pass. And I have been with families, I've been with folks as the doctor comes in and says, you know, we're sorry, there's nothing we can do. And so then, you know, the terrible question is asked, how long? How long do I have? How long do you think I have? And the doctor gives that news to that family, and it hurts and the pain. And I have often thought after I have been with these families, I've often thought, what if a doctor comes in one day and tells me the same? What are you going to do? What are you going to do with that time? Of course, a lot of it depends on how you feel physically and what's going on with you, but what would you do with that time? How would you treat that time? And so when you think about the Jews, okay, because word is spread everywhere. All the letters are passed out. All the officials know. In 11 months, Haman's going to get rid of us. But not just me, but my whole family. And not just my wife, my children, but my grandchildren, my mother and father, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, and everybody. How would you feel? Well, I think you'd feel terrible. Want to know what to do and how to do it. So as the word spread, notice that it says, verse 13, letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, to plunder and to plunder their possessions, to take what they had. Take what they had, and you can have it. It's yours. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all the people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. Terrible story. But I want you to think about and remember the providence of God. These 11 months would have been painful for the Jew. To think about 11 months, everybody's dead. 11 months, they're going to kill us. And to spend time thinking, why has God forsaken me? Why has God left us? Where is God? Why has God done this to us? Why has God gotten us to this point? You see all the questions that would come? They're natural. And by the way, if you go through a time like that, that is a natural thing. It doesn't mean that you may ask the questions. It doesn't mean that you've tested or tempted God. It's what you do with those questions and where you find the answers to those questions or try to find the answers to those questions. And ultimately then how you live in that time frame that may pose the problem. But not the questions themselves. And if you think I'm wrong, go back and read the book of Psalms. Psalmists often ask those questions. So you say, well, these 11 months had to be terrible. Yes, they did. But as we will see, and because we really know the end of the story already, but as we see, well, it took that time for God to work things out the way He wanted to work them out. To be patient with God is hard, isn't it? How often did you pray for rain this week? Well, if you're in the yard cutting business, you probably prayed, a lot of times every day. If you really don't like going to your yard, you probably said, Lord, just keep it dry. It's fine with me. You got a garden, though, you've probably prayed every day. Did you think you'd have to wait? Some got a few sprinkles last night. We got a little short rain. The grass is a little greener today than what it was yesterday. What about the old farmer that may have to wait for a long time for rain, for sufficient rain? To be patient with God is very difficult because we are prone to want things and want them now. These folks have to wait. But as we see, and like I say, later on, I want to study the subject. Probably got to have one of those mini studies that it took that time for God to get it all worked out, even though they had all the questions. Anything else anybody like to say about this chapter?
Is there any hint as to what the population of this area was and how many of those folks were Jews?
Not that I know of off the top of my head. I have wondered that, but I really haven't just, in passing seen it, and I haven't just set out to study it. That's a great question, though. I'm not aware of. I'll try to look into that. Anything else?
Paul, is this just, you mentioned that earlier, that Mordecai being a descendant of Benjamin, Saul, Kish, Haman being a descendant of Agag, Amalekites, that this could be his ultimate payback?
Could be.
Personally, Mordecai,
Yeah, could be. Yeah, because, go ahead. Yeah, because first of all, we're looking at a time frame of 400s, 479 in that neighborhood. So many years after all of that has transpired, and that in part has led, the Agag. We talked about that last week. We're not sure. We believe that it's a descendant of Agag, and but we can't, like we talked about, nail Jello to the wall. We can't do that. But that's the thought of some. That it's just sort of a final revenge for everything that's gone on to my folks through the years. Anything else? All good. All right, well, let's ease into the fourth chapter then. We have, and I hope you get this. I get it. I'm sure you do as well. Rightly so, a great period of mourning. But the mourning is very public. Mourning, let's talk about mourning for just a second. Mourning or grief, we call it grief. Grief is very real. And grief is experienced when there is any loss. Now we think of grief and death, but from a psychological standpoint, grief is understood at any loss of a job, loss of income, loss of health, loss, of course, from the standpoint of death of anyone that you know and love. And so anytime you experience a loss, there is a grief that comes with that loss. And grief is real. Don't think that it's not. And some people express their grief differently. I know of an individual that lost, really, she's lost all of her family members. And there are folks that would question me about her grief. And in talking to her a lot and knowing her, I understood why she was the way she was and how she was. And I tried to explain and tried to get people to understand she's grieving, but she's grieving the way she wants to grieve and the way she needs to grieve. She's fine. I've known some folks, however, that at least publicly show no signs of grief. And I know of an individual that not only in his times of grief does he not show any grief, he does not show any grief for others when they lose someone or have a loss. And that's not everybody does it differently. But one of the good traits is to learn to weep with those that weep, to mourn with those that mourn. To have that ability, to be one that can do that. And so, this man was with me with another man, and this man that couldn't mourn or didn't mourn was with me with another man, and we were there in a room watching a lady pass away, the third man's wife. And I knew that it was just a matter of time. And this man came in He looked at the lady, shrugged his shoulders, and walked out. The man whose wife passed away a few days later asked me what happened to him. He left. He didn't say anything to me. I know. I think personally that the individual has problems dealing with his own internal problems, and so thus he doesn't get involved in folks' problems, and there are situations like that, and so we can't condemn those people. But it is to say that all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, but here in this story, we're going to have Mordecai have this open mourning. And you might say, well, it's almost over the top. But do remember, even today, those in the Eastern countries, that when they mourn, they mourn. And even some today still do as they did in biblical times. You had paid mourners. How would you like for that to be your job? You know, you get paid to, when somebody passes away, cry and wail and mourn and holler and scream. Well, you do it for a few hours and then you go home. That was your job. Well, that occurred in biblical times. There is this public mourning that happens, and like I say, it makes sense. You don't have much longer to go before you pass away, so let's look at it. Mordecai learned all that had happened. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. These are signs of grief, mourning. You might say, well, wait a minute. Seems like I've always associated them with repentance. Well, when one repents, they grieve, they mourn over their wrong that they've committed. And so, much the same. And notice that it says he went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. Now, catch that, because Esther in a minute is going to tell him, go change clothes. We have to say, well, why? Well, because you didn't come into the king's presence with clothes that were mourning clothes. Kings didn't like to be associated with, tied with grief. They didn't like to be tied with things that they considered to be death. And so part of, evidently, especially at the time of King Ahasuerus, but it was true throughout the kings, you can't come in sackcloth. You can't come in here dressed like that. And so he's dressed as he would in a time of mourning. He's got, the black on, if you will. He's got the sackcloth, which is, by the way, sackcloth is the best way I've ever seen it described. Sackcloth is wool turned inside out. In other words, it is itchy, scratchy, and you just don't want any part of it. And so he's got all of this on. He's bitter. He's got bitter tears. He's crying. He's in anguish. And in every province, verse 3, it says, where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Well, we said, how would you spend your 11 months? These folks are going to spend their 11 months grieving. Maybe it was to make a point. Make the point that, this is terrible. Maybe it was, and I'm not saying that made it less genuine or real. I'm just simply saying this was, I'm going to make my point. This is terrible. This is awful. I don't know. Was it genuine? I'm sure it was. But there is this period of mourning, as it says, among the Jews. As word spreads, people get upset. Notice that Mordecai comes to the king's gate. We notice that in the first and second chapter especially. that he often went to the king's gate. And we talked about how that he would go to the king's gate, and that when Esther was made queen, that he was always there trying to find out about her. It seems as if from this text right here, at least to me, and I may be wrong, but at least to me it seems this way, that this had become a very common practice even after Esther is queen. That he still goes to the king's gate. Still interested in, and Esther probably also interested in what's going on. And so he goes, and word is being spread. So Esther's maids, verse 4, and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Now, like we said a while ago, Esther has been queen for about 5 years. How much did her inner circle know about her really? Had she, at one time or another, let them, so to speak, into her inner confidence? Had they found out that she was a Jew? Yeah, probably. It'd be very hard to have kept it from them, especially since she was so tied to Mordecai. And so, though, they come in and they tell her about Mordecai. You know, he's at the gate, he's wailing, he's crying, he's upset, he's rounding up the people, they're getting upset, he's in sackcloth, and so they come back and they tell Esther. And then verse 5. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Change clothes. Could that be that she wanted Mordecai to come see her and knew that Mordecai couldn't get into the palace with the clothes that he had on? Well, we'll see a little later on. We'll see as this story unfolds. Could it be, though, that she is sending Mordecai a message, get up and get going? Could it be that she is telling Mordecai, hey, it's going to all work out? Right now, and I want you to just put your mind in the story right now, not so much what we know, chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8, but what we know right now. She says, hey, here's some clothes. Get up out of these clothes of mourning. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it. So, verse 5, Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai, to learn what and why this was. What's going on? She wants to know. Here's one of her attendants. She evidently couldn't go. It seems as if, we're going to see here in just a second, it seems as if maybe she was secluded from the king. Kind of interesting, queen secluded from the king, but nevertheless, she wants to know. She can't evidently go to the gate. She can't go talk to Mordecai. So she sends somebody to go talk to her, or to him for her. And so when he comes back, or he went out, verse 6, Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that happened to him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree of the destruction which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, that he might command her to go unto the king, to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Mordecai is interesting in that he has one of the decrees with him. They didn't have the early stages of Xerox or copiers. They didn't have what we have today. Everything was handwritten, hand done. But it shows you, or it shows me at least, that there were many copies of this floating around. Now, it seems as if there were some in every province, and it seems as if they were probably being made and passed out as handbills. And so Mordecai, though, says, okay, here's what Esther needs to know. And he tells Hathach, the attendant of Esther, who goes and he says, look, he says, they're going to kill us. Haman's going to give money to the king's treasury. And he says, we need you, Esther. We need you to go in, and we need you to tell the king what's happening. Which would say, at least the way the Jewish folks were thinking at that time, this was a plot hatched by Haman. And the king really doesn't know what's going on, which would lead you to ask this question, or would lead me to ask this question: why doesn't the king know what's going on in his own kingdom? And I don't have an answer for that. But nevertheless, Mordecai says, Esther, go talk to Ahasuerus. Go tell him what's going on so that he'll know, so that he can change. And so Esther, then, verse 10, spoke to Hathach, gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. He said, now look. He said, no. She sends back word to Mordecai. The only person that can go to the king is anybody that, if they burst in, if you will, to the king, he has to hold out the scepter, basically saying you're invited. You have to be an invited guest. Now, you don't have to be an invited guest to come to Darty's house. You ever want to come, you come right along. It might be a little dirty, might be a little dusty, might be a dirty dish or two in the sink. That's all right. If you mind that, then probably ought not come, but you're still invited to come. But I dare say that if I show up at your house, it's probably the same way, right? We all live alike in many ways. But Esther is sending word back to Mordecai, look, you need to know that the king has to invite you. And if you just burst in, he's got to lay that scepter on you in order to say that you're accepted and let you stay. And let you in. But the key is not so much telling us the background as the key for me in this text is she says, but I hadn't even been in there for the last 30 days. I haven't been there for the last 30 days. Now, why is that? Don't know. She doesn't reveal, at least to this point, she doesn't reveal why she hasn't been there. She's been out, though. Maybe she had a falling out with the king. Maybe the king is trying to save her for something special. I know, of course, wife situation, king, queen situation is completely different. But I know that I don't like going a few days without seeing Suze. And so I know back several years ago, I had a gospel meeting in Talladega, Alabama. And I left Saturday about lunch, a little after lunch. And I got there and I preached, I preached something like 13 times between Sunday and Wednesday. And I was dead tired Wednesday night, stayed Wednesday night. But about 5 o'clock Thursday morning, I was on the road. I was on the interstate, headed back. Wanted to see Suze. Of course, when I got home, guess what? She was at work. So I had to wait till the end of the day. But needless to say, I was ready to get back home. Well, those things happen. And so here she is. She says, I haven't been with him for 30 days. Mordecai told them to answer Esther. Do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Well, he really tries to lay it on Esther. Mordecai really tries to lay it on Esther. He says, do you think you're going to escape all this? Would seem to say what? The king knows you're a Jew too. And you're not going to escape Haman. You're not going to escape his plot. And so you can't sit quietly, idly by and not do anything. You have to rise up. You have to say your piece. And he says, if you don't, he says, but you and your father's house will perish. Now remember, her folks are dead, but she would still have folks, kinfolks, if you will. And he says, it's almost as if Mordecai puts a curse upon her. I want you, though, to key in on the last part of verse 14. And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? He didn't say, and you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this. In other words, it's part of our verses that we're putting together, and when we talk about the providence of God here in a few weeks, we're not going to just talk about Esther, but we're seeing the providence of God in this book. And so he doesn't say, this is why God put you here. And I'll just go on and say this, and we will talk about it when we talk about the providence of God. And that is, we believe in the providence of God, we trust in the providence of God, but sometimes things are not always the providence of God. And so it's almost impossible for us to say, now I've got times in my life that, I look back and I say, boy, I see the providence of God as I look back. But it's ultimately it's something I can't do, is say, that was the providence of God. Well, maybe it all wasn't. We don't have what's called a divine interpreter. Divine interpreter says this was the providence of God. We don't have that. Well, am I discounting the providence of God? No. Am I saying it's all on me? No. I'm saying God works, and God works in us, through us. And I don't understand all of that, and I don't think anybody understands all that. God didn't reveal all that to us. But at the same time, too, we can say, maybe this was the hand of God. And that's what he's saying. Maybe God put you here for this. There's a time to shine, and we want you to shine. Well, let's just read this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days at night. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I'll go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went to his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. I'm going to pick up right there because I want to talk a little bit about fasting. Let me say this about fasting. I'm opposed to it. Okay? If you want to do it, you can do it. It's just not something I want to do. We'll talk a little bit about fasting next week. Sometimes we have to do it, and that's understandable. But from a standpoint of choice, no, I'm against it. I like to eat too much. Any questions, comments? Yeah.
It seems to me like Mordecai was a man that had some kind of authority because he was able to be close enough at the king's palace to hear about the plot to kill the king. He comes up with a copy of the decree that was sent to the governors, to the ruling parties. And it could be that Mordecai was a man of authority.
Absolutely.
That was put in his position, saying that. And he can tell Esther, I understand.
Absolutely.
I'm in the position that you're in now.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm not saying Mordecai was an evil man, but God used evil nations and men to accomplish his providence. So could, you asked the question, could Mordecai? Absolutely. Was Mordecai, at least from the way the story is told, in my assumption, had to have a place, a position, and was definitely a cog, if you will, in the God's whole plan of providence. And if he was not, here comes the question: how would Esther have known the plot? As it seems as if Esther didn't know what was going on until Mordecai sent word. And how did she find out? Well, she found out Mordecai was in front of the court grieving. So yes, I agree 100% with that. Anything else?
Was Mordecai's speaking what was the speech that he made to Esther? If you don't do this, someone else will. Did he already know?
Yeah. But that's a good thing to put in our heads to remember. Go to. Yeah, there was probably, there's always more than one way to skin a cat, as we've used that expression. Yeah, probably so. But it was Esther that he called on first, and which would have been the most likely. She was pointing. Anything else? All good. All right. Well, okay. We've got a minute, maybe. Let's have a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, thankful for the little rain that we got yesterday. We ask for more if it be your will. We also are thankful for the opportunity to study your word and to see through this great book, to see your hand at work in their lives, knowing that your hand is at work in our lives as well. We ask that you be with us, that you watch over us, bless us. Be with those that are on our announcement sheet and those that we mentioned at the beginning of class. Watch over them and keep them. Thank you for everything that we have, for we realize it's come from you. Watch over us and bless us and keep us and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Thank y'all. Y'all have a great week.